Welcome to the Bradley J. Show. Today we're going to talk about whether or not the character of our public servants and perhaps the character of the people of the nation has slipped a bit. And to do that, we're going to take a look at an example, the example of Justice Clarence Thomas and a possible conflict of interest there. And to help us out, we have Rich Rubino, who is a political commentator and a historian. And wait till he has a command of so many political facts and figures at the tip of his tongue. You'll find it amazing. So, Rich, how you doing?
Doing good. Thank you so much for having me on again, Bradley.
Of course. So, let's take a look at the situation with Clarence Thomas and his conflict of interest, and a similar situation that took place some time ago that ended up in the justice stepping down. And we seem to be very far away from that. And if you could, kind of catch us up on the facts as far as what's going on now and what's going on what went on historically, and maybe offer an opinion as to why things are different now. So start with the situation with current Justice Clarence Thomas.
Yeah. So Clarence Thomas, basically, it's been unearthed that he had essentially taken trips and that were funded by Harlan Crow, who was a Republican benefactor. He was actually a Never Trump advocate, but he's very much a conservative. His father was very much the same way. He's basically a billionaire, and he has given he's essentially been a benefactor of Clarence Thomas getting these free trips or lavish trips around the world. He said it's essentially because of his friendship. Clarence Thomas has not actually made much of an actual statement about it. Certainly, that's interesting about the Supreme Court specifically. They're kind of, Alexander Hamilton, kind of the least dangerous branch. But basically, they're the least accountable branch as well, because they're the only ones that are not elected directly by the people, and they serve perpetually. And the Constitution directly states under good behavior. So essentially, it is extremely austere to try to actually get a Supreme Court justice out of office. You would have to go through an entire process of essentially of impeaching, of convicting in the United States Senate, and it's very hard for that to happen. But that's basically what happened. And if you go back to Abe Fortas was a protege of Lyndon Johnson. Very interesting. Lyndon Johnson got him on the Supreme Court first as an associate justice. Then he wanted to become the chief justice, but it was unearthed at the time that he had essentially taken $20,000 from somebody who was a financier who had business before the court, and he then resigned. And what's interesting, the difference between Thomas and Abe Fortas is at the time of Abe Fortas, there were Democrats in the United States Senate that wanted him to resign, including an ally of Lyndon Johnson, Walter Mondale, believe it or not. Yes, that Walter Mondale, who was a protege of Hubert Humphrey, who became the vice president under Jimmy Carter, the presidential nominee in 1984 of the Democratic Party. He led the charge of the Democratic Party, essentially, to say that Abe Fortas should resign, and Abe Fortas subsequently did resign.
So, what is there about a society where Fortas would resign over a conflict of interest and a Thomas won't? Our society has changed, has it not? It seems that before, character mattered in a bipartisan way, and conflict of interest mattered in a bipartisan way. And a sense of propriety, the perception of propriety mattered in a bipartisan way. Now it doesn't at all. And does that seem like an example of a symptom of something wrong more deeply in our society, reflected by our public servants?
Well, I think that, a lot of it, you have to take this on a case-by-case basis, and a lot of it is about Clarence Thomas, the individual, and Abe Fortas, the individual, respectively, as opposed to kind of this big partisan infrastructure. But that being said, bipartisanship and partisanship were different in the 1960s. In the 1960s, you had the Democratic Party, which was essentially conservative Southern Democrats and liberal Northeastern Democrats, and sometimes Midwestern Democrats like Hubert Humphrey, for example. And on the Republican side, you had conservative Republicans in the West and liberal Republicans in the Northeast. So accordingly, it was not ideologically polarized. It was not as ideologically homogenous as it is contemporaneously. But that being said, there were some liberals, Walter Mondale being one, Senator Tidings from Maryland being another, who led the charge for him to resign. Today, if somebody were to come out, if there was a conservative Republican who were to come out and say, Clarence Thomas, I think you should resign, what would happen? My guess would be they'd have a primary challenge in their next election, because there is an infrastructure amongst the conservative movement that anybody who kind of goes against, who's recreant to traditional conservative orthodoxy, immediately has a challenge. You see this, for example, in the debt ceiling. Folks like Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan, who voted for the debt ceiling agreement. Steve Bannon is already talking about the possibility of having a mega challenge against them in their congressional district because they went against the way that Donald Trump and conservatives would have voted on the debt ceiling. So this is the same thing in the Supreme Court. If anybody, it's like the third rail of conservative politics. If you go against Clarence Thomas, you essentially, it's the third rail. I mean, good luck to you, but you essentially die politically just about, because everyone's worried about not the general election. They're worried about their primary challenger. And any House member who does that, it's the exact same thing.
Seems like it's party and ideology over country now, and that the notion of the United States and its functioning properly, carrying on being of paramount importance, doesn't exist like it used to. And now it's me, us, us, us. Do you sense that?
Yeah, but I think it's also, I don't think it's something new necessarily to 2023. I think it has historic precedent. I think it just, self-preservation is the first rule of survival for a human being. And politicians, I don't think politicians now come from a different crop, or they're a different breed, or they're a different species than politicians were in 1968.
But survival used to be defined in terms of survival of the United States, and now it's survival of me.
I think for everybody, every human being has a multiplicity of motivations. Some of it is about the survival of the United States. Some of it is about patriotism. Others is you want a paycheck. Others is you want to essentially move up. And if, for example, you're thinking about, let's say most senators, when they get there, when you say Mr. President, they all, as Bob Dole said, 99 or 100 of them look back and they, because they all want to be president at some point. And right now, the conservative movement is essentially superintending the Republican Party. So accordingly, they are very supportive of Clarence Thomas. So if I'm a Republican and I represent a state like Mississippi, for example, if I want re-election, or if I want to become a viable presidential candidate at some point, and I say, you know what, I think Clarence Thomas should resign, then I will not be accepted by the contemporaneous conservative movement, and I'll be seen as almost kind of a gadfly. And if I ever did run for president, I'd be what Lowell Weicker was in 1980, for example. He ran for president as a liberal Republican, and he got nowhere. So I think they realize that, and what they're saying behind closed doors, I don't know. What they actually believe, I don't know. But just from a purely political standpoint, they're essentially looking out for their own survival.
Real quick on another thing, Kevin McCarthy kind of bucked the Freedom Caucus and worked with Biden to get a budget done, and good for him. He put country over party in this case, and he may pay the price for that. At any time they could call for a vote and remove him. If that happened, couldn't he run? And why wouldn't he run for president?
Kevin McCarthy, well, I think because he'd be dead in the water if he ever were to try that, because he would be seen as an anti-Trump Republican. First of all, he's not particularly popular within the conservative movement, which leads the Republican Party in the first place. So he's seen as an establishment Republican. That's why folks like Matt Gaetz and Lori Boebert and Chip Roy from Texas and a lot of the Freedom Caucus members, Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, led the charge against him, because they know that if they know that for them to move up politically, they need the support of the conservative movement, and Kevin McCarthy is seen as an establishment Republican. And the fact that Trump supported him, I think got some Republicans kicking and screaming to say, okay, I'm going to vote for him in the final analysis. So now if he were to run, he would be seen as a throwback of Republican Party, basically every Republican from Eisenhower to Bush, and they are persona non grata in the Republican Party today. So Kevin McCarthy runs. It'd be like if Denny Hastert ran, or if Mitch McConnell had run, or Paul Ryan or John Boehner. They just would have gotten absolutely nowhere, because the Republican Party does not like what they call the deep state, and they certainly do not like establishment Republicans.
All right. So you're saying that an establishment Republican has no chance?
Yes, absolutely. Virtually no chance of being a viable candidate. Yes.
Oh, before we wrap this up, I'm going to go back and make my wild assertion that, and I don't feel bad that it's unlikely this will take place. I won't feel bad if it doesn't. But I'm going back to say that neither Trump nor DeSantis will be the nominee. And if I'm wrong, we'll just forget I said this. If I'm right, I'll never let you forget I said this.
Yes.
Rich Rubino, thank you very much. As always, you're excellent. And we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely.